I'm John Kelsall, and this is my wife, Terry Kelsall. We're here to enjoy a wonderful book called The Love Scribe by Amy Meyerson, and it's brought to you by the Eyes on Books with the Video Club of Laguna Woods Village. This is a very intriguing book that goes in many different directions, in fantasy, in mystery, intrigue.
Okay, I'll pick up from here.
Thank you.
There is so much fantasy in this book. It starts out a bit slow. And the main character is Alice and her best friend Gabby. So Alice, who loves writing, she takes off with her best friend Gabby, and they are into, well, Alice believes that she can write love stories. But her idea of a love story is when she writes, everything she writes leads to love. And she not only writes for her best friend, she writes for other individuals as well.
Well, she learned she could do that through writing for Gabby.
Yes.
And each writing she does is unique to that person.
Yes. And she's inspired. She gets inspiration from, we're not quite sure where she gets inspiration from.
But once she gets it, she has to go write regardless of the time of day.
Yeah. And eventually all these writings turn into little journals that she puts together. And she finds somebody who binds these journals for her. And each book or journal is done in red. Each one is a fantasy. And each one is unique.
And the love may not occur with the first connection, but it ultimately does occur.
But very quickly.
Yes.
Very, very quickly. So it becomes so successful that people start wanting to pay her money. To the point that she doesn't have to actually work at an outside job. She does work, and she does catering for another person.
But what's interesting, during all of these little journals that she writes, she can't find love herself.
Or she chooses not to find love herself.
Yeah.
And I think she's afraid to find love herself.
I agree.
So she will take on these writing escapades. I can't think of another word to define this, but people will come to her and say, please write me a love story. And from all over, people are coming to her and saying, I will pay you to write me a love story. And she takes on one after another after another. And I wasn't quite sure how enthralled I was with this to begin with. Because
well, it took a while to build everything up and set all of the different scenarios and give you all the information you would need for further in through the book.
And like I said, it started out really slow. But people started paying huge sums of
Thousands
money.
of dollars.
And it paid her rent, it paid her expenses, and so she felt this was the way to go. I am successful. I am so successful at what I'm doing. So she just kept on and on. And she thought, yes, this is a love story. And these are all love stories. And I'm just going to keep doing this. Madeline was the strangest request of all.
Yes, and invited her to her house,
Yes.
which she reluctantly went to, and found out it was way out into the woods, down this dirt road with nobody else nearby. And all of a sudden, this wonderful cabin shows up.
She had a hard time finding the cabin. And on her way to the cabin, she came across this tavern. And Alice remembered this tavern where her father used to take her. Now, Alice's mother, before we make our way into the woods, Alice's mother was named Bobby, and Bobby was a doctor. And Alice lost her father as she was growing up, and Alice's mother wanted her to write her a story, a love story, because at first she thought, Alice's mother thought, she didn't need a love story because she had such a fulfilling life. And then all of a sudden she decided, you know what? I want love. I'm ready for love. So she asked her daughter to write her a love story.
Who reluctantly did after much pleading.
Yes. So Alice wrote her a story, and immediately, which happened
So many times before.
so many times before, she wrote her a love story, and then as soon as she wrote a love story, the person who she wrote it for fell in love so quickly.
And many of them mysteriously, very, very serendipitous.
Yes, and the person sort of dropped out of Alice's life for a short little while because they found the person that they wanted to fall in love with, and they did. And Alice always wondered, well, what is happening to this person in my life? They're disappearing for a while.
Yeah.
But it was because they were falling in love with
They
somebody.
didn't need Alice anymore.
Or for a short little while.
Right.
And the same thing happened with her friend, Gabby.
Gabby.
So off these women went to find love, and it was very successful for a while. But then she was summoned. Alice was summoned.
A good word.
Yes,
By Madeline.
by Madeline.
Via
And-
letter.
And she was intrigued. Alice was intrigued by this letter. So she figured, and normally the people came to Alice.
Yes. This is the first time Alice goes to her client.
So off she goes to find this client. And
that's when a lot of the intrigue really begins to mushroom.
this book was mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It really was mind-boggling. You needed the first part of the book to build
And
And-
understand.
to understand what was happening in all these people's lives.
Yeah.
But then Madeline comes on the scene, and you find out what's going on. Well, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, there are many innuendos in that whole Madeline mystique and mystery, and there's secret rooms and secret libraries and all kinds of interesting things that build off of that Alice Madison relationship.
It was absolutely fantastical. And all the other stories sort of took a back seat to this Madeline person. So Alice winds up entwined in Madeline's life. But there were long breaks in this story. And meanwhile, Alice befriends some people, and she befriends this couple. And one of the men is Joe.
Joe.
And Joe is an artist.
Yes.
And he decides to do a painting
of Alice.
And Alice is a very old soul at heart.
But young in age.
Yes. But he also has a lover, a guy. And Joe does a painting of Alice. And I can't give the whole story
Yeah, you don't want to give it all away, but the point is, the painting that he does of Alice, let's just put it this way, is not what you expect.
Oh, not at all.
And that painting begins to unlock the door to mysteries and intrigue and underlying stories that just flutter through everything that's going on when she's at Madeline's house. Madeline's house, for me, was when it really blew up. I mean, the story really exploded into this mass intrigue that you couldn't put the book down.
And I'm glad you said that, because it got to the point where I could not put the book down.
Yes.
It was so fascinating. And
she'd take you in a direction that you thought you were following, and all of a sudden you found out you were on a different path.
So Alice was a love scribe. She was telling stories for people so they could fall in love.
Yes.
And then they discovered that Madeline was also a love scribe.
Yes.
So they had something in common.
And the book, the library in Madeline's house, ends up being very intriguing and very critical to, at least in my mind, to the central theme of the book, and the outcome of the book is all built into, in my mind, is all inside that magnificent house in the woods.
And everything in that house was magical.
Yes.
Absolutely magical. And you say, what next? What next? Everything in the house kept changing. The floral wallpaper kept blooming, but it was wallpaper.
Don't give everything away. You might want to.
I'm not giving it away.
Well, once you get into the house is the intrigue, and that's where I want our readers to really look forward to really enjoying the book. And I really want to ask Amy, where did she come up with this idea? Where was the impetus or the origin, the genesis of this book?
And Madeline was an old woman.
Yeah.
She was a very old woman. And you're wondering, how is she so young but so old? I thought she was going to die every minute. And she didn't.
Okay. Well, what we need to do is we've given away quite a bit of the story.
We can't end there because there's still so much of this book to
But we have to
explore.
let our readers go on that wonderful adventure to the rest of the story, shall we say, needs to be left to the wonderful readers that will read the book and have that wonderful adventure that we had.
And I have to say, you must read this book.
Yes, and don't let the beginning, the beginning of the book sets up the evolution and the basis for the whole rest of the book. So anyway, number one, we highly recommend the book. Don't get bogged down in the very beginning when you start reading it because you think this is a little slow and evolving, but you'll need all of that information for when it does just explode. So we hope we're going to be able to talk with Amy Meyerson in just a few minutes. And then we have Amy on the line with us. So here's Amy. That was great. Hello, Amy.
This is our wonderful author, Amy Myers. Amy, I cannot believe what we went through with this book. It was wonderful. All of it was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
My very first question to you, and it'll probably take us through the entire interview, was where did you get all your incredible ideas?
What was the genesis?
Yeah, so this book started a little differently than my other books. It actually started with it started during COVID, and I was working on a different novel that I really didn't have when I was at home the resources to research the way I wanted to. So I was trying to think about what to write in its place, and then at that time I was reading a lot of escapist fiction, and not really fantasy, but more kind of like my book, sort of magical or fabulous stories. And my editor said to me, she said, well, what about if you wrote a love story next? And I was trying to think about what kind of love story I would want to write. And I decided that I thought it'd be interesting to write a story that was, not romance, but rather kind of a meditation on love. And so kind of from that, so it almost started with like a prompt from my editor. And from there, I started thinking about this thing I'd heard that people have at weddings now. I've never actually been to one with it, but where you can hire a poet and they will come to your wedding or your party or whatever, and will write love poems on demand. And I've just been really charmed by that for a long time, and that got me thinking, well, what if, as opposed to that, it was somebody who actually wrote stories that really made people fall in love, that had this magical quality to them. And the idea kind of spawned from there, and I kept asking these questions of, well, what if this and what if that? And if your viewers aren't familiar with the book, it's about this woman, Alice, who discovers through her best friend's breakup that she has this gift to write stories that help people find love. And then, of course, finding love and staying in love aren't quite the same thing. And so things kind of go a little wrong from there. And she meets this mysterious woman who wants her to write her one last love story. So there's a ton, I think this is what you were getting at. There's a ton of stories within the story. Yeah. There's lots of little fables that are the stories that Alice gives to her clients. And it was just really, really fun. I felt very free with this book to come up with all these little vignettes and to kind of follow things through to their end. And but it does have a ton of stories within the story. And I think actually a large part of that was that I wrote this when I was home during the height of COVID. And I think what you're seeing now is a lot of books that have been coming out within the last 6 months or so through the rest of the year probably are people's COVID books. And what I mean by that is it's things that they wrote really in isolation. And I think in response to that, you're seeing people write slightly different things than they've written before. And that's certainly how I felt because I kind of blocked out the whole outside world. I felt really free to go into this imaginative space that maybe if I was interacting more with people outside my family, I don't know, I would have bounced ideas off of people. I would have second guessed myself. So a lot of this really came from having that very intense time kind of disconnected with other things.
Well, you did a superb job with it,
Yes,
by the way.
yes. Yeah, so you were sort of like Alice.
Yeah, I guess. Although I don't think I can write stories that actually bring people love, but maybe inspire change. I don't know.
It sounds as though it almost wrote itself through you, or did you have to create?
It's funny, it did sort of feel like that, and that's in the book, how I describe Alice's stories is that's why she calls herself a scribe, is that she feels less like the writer or the owner of the stories, as opposed to someone they kind of just, yeah, kind of run through. And when I was writing, I felt like a lot of this, I didn't kind of censor myself as I was writing. So it did feel in some ways, it was shaping it and turning it into a cohesive narrative was definitely a lot of active work, but a lot of the drafting and writing of it, I really just kind of let my creativity go where it wanted. So it did feel in some ways like the story kind of like Alice, it just sort of flowed out of me.
Well, it comes across almost that way when you're reading the book, and Terry and I both were fascinated with it, and we understand it. The first part of the book, you kind of had to develop the background, the knowledge, the innuendos to be able to then, as I say, it explodes when you get to Madeline. I mean, it just absolutely explodes. All of the nuances, the allegories, just were flowing through me when I was in that part and couldn't put it down. It was just absolutely fascinating, intriguing, optimistic. Like I said, I couldn't put it down. Terry said the same thing, especially when we got to driving into the cabin in the woods. I spent my first 20 years of life up in the Adirondacks at a camp that was, the only way you get to it is by boat. So
Oh, wow.
some of this, when you're talking about that cabin in the woods, just shot me right back to where I was as a kid. Anyway.
So,
Yeah, that's a area north of Santa Barbara, like in between Santa Barbara and then wine country. And I've just always really loved it up there. We for vacations go up there a lot, and I knew I wanted to set the house there. And I knew I wanted right away, when I was sort of thinking of this romantic story, I decided that I wanted to set it in Santa Barbara because I think of it as this very kind of romantic, magical place. And I wanted to have a city where there was somewhere sort of in the mountains and isolated nearby. So
Does this house actually exist in Santa Barbara?
no. So where there are some houses around that area, but not right where I put Madeline's house. It's all woods. And I kind of wanted that because, if people know the area, I wanted them to say, there's no house there.
Way back in the woods, very isolated, totally surrounded by nature and not humanity. And especially the road that goes into the house. Is there a special significance to that, or you just wanted that isolation for Madeline and Alice?
Well, I wanted to play around sort of with the trope of the old lady in the woods that comes up a lot in fables and fairy tales and stuff like that, and in literature, and also the sort of idea of kind of moving to this other place so that it feels completely disconnected. So I think the woods was just kind of playing around with that trope, but they sort of needed that distance, so it felt, cut off from Alice's life and sort of cut off from the rest of the world.
Wow. And the one time when you had Joe do the painting of Alice, and I'm not going to give away the intrigue that goes along with it, but as soon as you revealed the painting, I went, wow. That was not what I was expecting. And then all of a sudden, all these meanings and directions you could go with it were, once I got to that point in the book, I was all over the place. I mean, I had all kinds of trying to decipher, what does this mean? What does that mean? Does it even have to mean? You know, I was trying to struggle with what had to have meaning and what I should just accept for what it was.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, one of the things I've learned, because this is my third novel, is that, which is one of the parts I've learned to love about writing, is that what I think a book is about, or what its significance is, and what readers think its significance is often two different things in a really lovely way. That, readers bring their own experience and their own perspective into anything that they read. And this novel is as much about writing as it is really about relationships and different kinds of love. And so that was one of the things I wanted to explore in this book, is that it could have different meanings for different people. And in response to that, I wanted to set up, and I've done this with all of my books, set up kind of a challenge for myself as a writer to learn something new about writing and to grow. And so for this book, I really wanted there to be kind of a twist where hopefully when you get to it, you look back and things make sense that you didn't see or realize before. But it's been nice in talking to readers and seeing that, even though I have a sense of what I think each part means, they bring their own meaning to it. And I think that is kind of the, that's once, and I say this in the book, but once you put something out there, it doesn't belong to the writer anymore. It belongs to the reader.
And
I think I really like books that kind of start off slow and then speed up. And I think that that's sort of a traditional form of storytelling. And, nowadays there's a pressure that everything needs to start really quickly on page one. I mean, you see the same thing in film too, where it needs to start right away. And for me, I need to get to know the characters a little bit. I need to settle into a story before I feel invested in a character's journey. So I tend to be drawn to, and I tend to also write stories that do. I liked that comparison you said about like 5 miles per hour versus 100.
And we want to thank you so much, number one, for writing the book. Number two, for the genesis and the build from 5 to 100. And the drawing in and ruining some of our sleep because we couldn't put it down, but that's But anyway, thank you so much, Amy, for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a good day, and look for more Eyes on Books sessions.